Welcome, students. We shall be speaking on the research methodology course today. The topic on which I shall be discussing is the relationship between history and anthropology. Now, before we go into the depth of the subject, we need to understand what history is all about and what anthropology is all about. History is a subject that relates the past with the present. Usually the notion, all of us, we have this notion that history is a subject connected with the past. But the definition of history is actually, it is a subject that relates the past with the present. E.H. Carr has considered history as an unending dialogue between the past and the present. So this is the definition of history. Now let us define anthropology. Anthropology, on the other hand, is concerned with culture, society, behavior, linguistics, and civilization connected with human beings. The Oxford Dictionary has defined anthropology as a study of mankind, especially of its societies and customs, a study on structure and evolution of man. So these are the two definitions of the subjects. So what difference do we find? That is, history is a subject that deals with man, the past connected with man with the present, while anthropology primarily focuses on societies, culture, behavior, linguistics, and the evolution of man. So these are the definitions of history and anthropology. Next, I go to the emergence of anthropology as a subject. Here, we will not talk much about the emergence of history as a subject, because in your other discussions, in your other lessons, you have already studied that in ancient Greece, we find that history as a subject had come up. Here we shall focus more on the emergence of anthropology as a subject, because history is comparatively an older subject than anthropology. Anthropology emerged as a modern sense of a term during the age of Enlightenment, when there was a growing emphasis on knowing about human culture and society. Now the question comes, what is Enlightenment all about, or the age of Enlightenment? The age of Enlightenment is an intellectual and philosophical movement that dominated Europe during the 17th and the 18th centuries. During this period, we find that under the influence of Enlightenment, we find that there was increasing emphasis on reason behind creation of knowledge, on evidences as sources of knowledge. Thus, we find new forms of ideas, new types of ideas coming up during this time. We find that there was growing importance on topics or aspects or notions like natural laws, progress, liberty, equality, toleration, fraternity, constitutional government, then separation of the church and the state. So all these aspects gained new form of importance during the Enlightenment period. So as a result of this new search for knowledge, we find that during the Enlightenment movement, there was a growing urge among the people to know about human culture and study the reasons behind evolution of human beings and human societies and everything, culture, behavior, language, all these aspects connected with mankind. The age of Enlightenment was an era of cultural revolution, when there was a growing urge to know about human behavior, language, and society. During this period, anthropology as a field of study was perceived as a branch within history. We find that it was considered as a branch within natural history that examined the origin of man and diversification of human race. So by the 19th century, we find that with archaeological excavations made into human past, made into human remains in England and in other parts of Europe, it was realized that culture was the common element that united as well as distinguished human races across the world. So we find that a group of people emerged, a group of scholars came up who wanted to research on these areas. Thus, the sphere of study known as anthropology came up that investigated into human culture, institutions, and civilization. Independent methods of investigation developed with the growth of anthropological enquiries. We find that independent methods of investigation developed during this period. Within anthropology, we find that new types of or new ways of looking into human race came up during this period. Thus, we find the growth of ethnology, the emergence of the genre of ethnological enquiries. Then we find the participant observation methods, etc. These were methods connected with anthropological investigation and examination. Anthropology focused on learned behavior of people, the languages spoken by them, the structures, traditions, then institutions, beliefs. Then we find the material usages of men. All these were considered as subject matter by the anthropologist. We find that when anthropology started looking into these aspects, we find that even within the broader term of anthropology, we find that different fields of anthropology came up. In course of time, although this developed, we find that cultural anthropology came up, social anthropology came up, linguistic anthropology came up. So these different genres of anthropology came up subsequently with the growth of the subject. We find that a branch of anthropology that concentrated on biological evolution of human beings and its connection with human social and cultural behavior also emerged. And this field of anthropology was known as biological anthropology. So thus, we find that with anthropological investigation coming up, we find different genres of anthropology started emerging. As I have already discussed, that in course of time, we find the branch of anthropology that examined the linguistics connected with man was considered as linguistic anthropology. The branch of anthropology that dealt with the societies, human societies or societies of men was considered as social anthropology. So we find different branches of the subject in course of time. So, and we find that a separate genre of biological anthropology also emerged during this period. This branch discussed or described more about the biological evolution of man and the connection of biological evolution with human social and cultural behavior. So we find that different branches within anthropology came up, and all these branches cumulatively played an important role in giving a concrete shape to the subject, and as a result of which, by the late 19th century, anthropology appeared or emerged as a distinct discipline, different from history, distinct discipline from history, I would say. And we find that the character of this discipline was different from history. From which perspective? Now the question comes. Anthropology both had social and scientific dimensions, while in history we find only social dimensions. So this was a basic difference between both the subject. Anthropologists like B. Malinowski, Radcliffe Brown, Forts, and Nadel, we find that these people believed that evolution of human culture and societies follows the laws of nature. These anthropologists believe that human culture and societies follows the laws of nature and natural sciences, and therefore the principles and generalization of sciences could be applied in anthropological research also. So such viewpoints or such observations by the anthropologist gave a scientific dimension to the subject. Franz Boas applied scientific methods in anthropology for the first time, and therefore he is considered as the father of anthropology. In India, Sharat Chandra Ray applied ethnographical research for understanding indigenous and tribal problems and issues. Therefore, he is considered as the father of Indian ethnology and the first anthropologist in India. Now we shall focus about the interdependence and similarities between history and anthropology. Though anthropology emerged as a distinct subject, different from history by the late 19th and the early 20th century, we find that both the subjects are interdependent and interconnected. We find that there are some common areas of inquiries in both the subjects, since both the subjects speaks about origin and evolution of man. While anthropology inquires about men from both scientific and social science dimension, history examines it from social science perspective only. In such spheres of conversation, we can say that archaeology becomes immensely helpful for both the historians and the anthropologists who try to understand the subject, or here in this context, when we talk about history and archaeology, we can say that anthropology also tries to understand human past. It is also concerned with present as well as the past, while in history, we focus more on the past. Although a genre of history known as contemporary history is there, but still the perspective is on the past. So thus we find that in these types of inquiries, archaeology becomes a very important subject for both the disciplines. Because we find that both the historians and the anthropologists, they try to understand human past by investigating into the use of material remains by men. In the study of history, anthropological discussions come up when a historian attempts to draw political, economic, social, and cultural linkages within and among human communities across time and space. Similarly, anthropological arguments cannot be successfully established without discussions on history. Historical pursuits often include interdisciplinary approaches. Now, with the expansion of the scope of the subject, history is no longer a study connected with wars, battles, treaties, agreements, kings and queens. History has become a subject which is vast in scope and ever expanding in scope. So with such expansion, or with this expansion, we find that history has acquired an interdisciplinary character. And with this acquisition, anthropological investigation or investigating into historical past from anthropological perspective has become more important for the historians nowadays. More or less, in fact, here in this context, I would like to mention that this using anthropological perspective in history is not a recent way of looking into things, or is not a recent way of historical research. As we know that Herodotus, the father of history, also adapted historical and anthropological methods. We find that while writing on the Greco-Persian War, he traveled across Egypt, Ukraine, Syria, Italy, Lydia, all these places he traveled for tracing the reasons behind the Greco-Persian wars, because he believed that the Greco-Persian War could not be described or understood by only focusing on political factors. The role of geography, the influence of people had played an important role behind the Greco-Persian War. So Herodotus wanted to look into these aspects as well. So we can say that he adapted anthropological methods also when he wrote about the Greco-Persian War. So thus we can say that although By the late 19th and the early 20th century, anthropology emerged as a subject different from history with its new new ways of looking into things, or we can say that with its new characteristics. But still, we can say that this way of looking into history, that is historical research, this interdisciplinary method of combining history and anthropology is as old as Herodotus. We can say that. So it is not something very recent. But certainly, with the expansion of the scope of the subject, this interdisciplinary method is more used by the historians nowadays. So studies in natural history have been beneficial to the anthropologists who worked on the origin of Homo sapiens. So you can see that history and anthropology, they are interconnected with each other in so many ways. History and anthropology are thus intimately associated with each other. As anthropology analyzes men from historical perspective also, therefore history is an essential part of anthropology. Both the subjects actually they complement each other, we can say so. Anthropology is dependent on history to understand socio-cultural changes within among men across time. Anthropology takes the help of history for knowing the methods and practices connected with the temporal phenomena. So, for investigating human behavior and psychological origin of man, and for comprehending material changes and linguistic variations in human societies, we find that the anthropologists have depended on history from the very beginning of their investigations. So both the arenas of knowledge assist each other in documenting testimonies about the first human on earth, growth of human culture and civilization, then for recording the transition from prehistory to colonialism, globalization, and after. With the expansion of the scope of both the disciplines, we can say that the interdependence between them has increased. And we find that in many aspects, we find that history and anthropology has become similar in scope, we can say. In various aspects, history and anthropology has become similar in scope. Both deal with men, both deal with human societies, both the subjects speak about the past. Although anthropology is not primarily concerned with the past, but still, in order to discuss or investigate into the evolution of man, the anthropologists have to look into the past. Therefore, often the modes of conducting research in both the disciplines are similar. Like, for example, we find that fieldwork is essential for both history and anthropology. Teamwork is essential for both the historians and the anthropologist. So both anthropology and history trace continuities, changes, patterns, structures among human societies, among human culture and behavior, and both the disciplines also focus on temporal phenomena connected with men. So these were the basic areas of interdependence or similarities between both the subjects. Now let us speak about some differences. So till now we have focused on some important aspects. Firstly, we have discussed what are the definitions of history and anthropology, how anthropology and history are, what they basically describe. Then we focused on what are the areas of interdependence and similarities. Then for doing this, we also spoke about how anthropology as a subject emerged and what are the areas of perspectives that differentiate anthropology from history. Why it has emerged as a separate discipline. Previously, as in our discussion, we have talked about this aspect that anthropology was considered as a part of natural history at one point of time. During the Enlightenment era, when there was growing emphasis on reason behind creation of knowledge, when there was the increasing emphasis on evidences as sources of knowledge, during this period, we find that new ways of looking into things emerged, and those factors actually contributed to the growth of anthropology as a subject. Now, here in this context, we will be focusing about the differences between both the subjects. Although we have spoken about this aspect to some extent, but now we shall speak about that in a bit detail. Like, despite the similarities between history and anthropology, we find that both the subjects have some differences also. The first difference is history is broader than anthropology in scope. Anthropology is narrower in scope than history. So this is the first major difference between both the subject. Now, while history deals with human past, the subject matter of anthropology is not primarily concerned with human past. Although it also focuses on human past, but that is not the primary area of research or discussion or whatever. Then we find that human beings from both the past and the present context are discussed in anthropology. Anthropology focuses primarily on culture, human behavior, human society. Then for this, we find that anthropologists take the help of oral sources, folk tales. While history, we find that history deals with all aspects connected with men. Every aspect connected with men, and although the research on aspects connected with men are done from historical perspective. So from this particular dimension, we can say that this is the reason why history is broader in scope than anthropology. Emphasis on human culture and society are not the focus of discussion in history. In history, we speak about human beings from all perspective. Now, as I have already mentioned, that the scope of the subject has expanded like anything. The scope of history has expanded like anything. There was a time when oral sources were not considered as legitimate evidence for writing history. But now we find that oral sources and folklores have become an important source of information about societies on which we do not find written sources. So thus, this is an instance about the growth of the subject. History draws a connectivity associated with the past and effect related to a certain event. But anthropology defines a human group. Here you see, anthropology defines a human group. It tries to analyze human behavior, traits, and common features connected with human culture. Anthropology defines human behavior and association of human beings, but history makes an analysis of events. While anthropology tries to achieve a certain goal of discussion, history deals with every event connected with human race. So, anthropological discussions have certain goals. That is, a cultural anthropologist will primarily focus on culture. Linguistic anthropologist will focus on language, linguistics connected with men. But in history, we find that in order to understand a certain event, all these aspects have to be studied, understood, and researched, you can say. So, history analyzes human past from social science perspective, while anthropology analyzes a subject from social science as well as from scientific perspective. So, these are the basic differences. So, till now we have spoken about let me just summarize. We have, in the beginning of our discussion, we have discussed about the definitions of history. That is, history is a subject that relates the past with the present. That is, by understanding the past, you can understand the present or the future in a better way. That is the definition of history. While anthropology focuses more on culture, societies, behavior, linguistics, and evolution of men, evolution of human society. So these are the basic differences. Then we find that how anthropology as a discipline came up. As I have already discussed, that it was a product of the Enlightenment era. The Enlightenment era dominated Europe during the 17th and the 18th century. So when there was growing emphasis or increasing emphasis on reason, and we find that new concepts came up during this period. We find that progress, liberty, equality, separation of church and the state, all these were highlighted during this period, as a result of which new ways of looking into into various aspects connected with men were gained importance during this period. So thus, with this, we find the emergence of anthropology as a separate discipline. Now, we have already discussed this particular aspect, that previously, prior to this, anthropology was considered as a branch of natural history. So thus, by the late 19th and the early 20th century, we find that anthropology came up as a separate subject. But the interdependence between both the subjects remained. The interdependence between both the subject remained. So we find that both anthropology and history complement each other in various ways. They are similar to each other in various ways. We find that both the subjects talk about man, both the subjects discuss about man, human society, behavior and culture. Both the subjects speak about human past, and as I have already told, that anthropology focuses on human past as well as the present. We find that the social dimension or social perspective of looking into various aspects connected with man, this particular thing is common in both anthropology and history. And we find that both the anthropologists and historians, they try to look into human past and take the help of archaeology. So archaeology is a subject which is helpful for both the historians and the anthropologists. So these are the basic areas of dependence which we have come across, we have already discussed, and the historians depend on anthropologists for understanding political, cultural, social aspects connected with man. Similarly, anthropologists also depend on history for understanding these aspects. So thus we find that both the subjects help each other actually, and therefore we find that the father of history writing, Herodotus, took the help of anthropological and historical and anthropological method for understanding the past, and this method is more used by the historians in the present context with the expansion of the scope of history as a subject. So these are the basic areas of similarities which we have discussed. Now see that there are certain areas of differences. Let me quickly just summarize that. That is, we find that history is comparatively broader in scope than anthropology. While history deals with human past, anthropology deals with both past and present connected with man. While history focuses more on social science dimension, we find that anthropology focuses on both social and scientific dimension. Then we find that anthropology, both history and anthropology, they deal with causes and effect connected with a certain event. Anthropology focuses more on a certain human group. It focuses more on a community, the behavior, the culture, the various characteristics or traits connected with the community. History, on the contrary, it focuses on all aspects connected with man, not necessarily or not primarily focusing on a community. Everything connected with men is the subject matter of history. So thus in anthropology, we find that the anthropologists try to answer to certain goals, or they seek answer for certain questions. But in history, we find that history deals with everything connected with men. So these are the basic areas of differences. With this, I hope the discussion has been helpful to you. And with this, I would come to an end of the discussion. Thank you.